a few pages from the red brick section of the book. This is called The Bamboo Grove. A geological cleavage slices through North Carolina from south to north, with sandhills on the eastern side of the divide and red clay in the Piedmont to the west. My great-grandfather, John Abner Thomas, lived right on the divide in the hamlet of Cameron, North Carolina, and he made his living from both sand and clay. During the spring and summer, he grew broadleaf tobacco in the white sand, and during the fall and winter, he laid red brick among the farms and villages around nearby Sanford, the self-proclaimed brick capital USA, where brick factories still line the perimeter of the city. Abner's own father had been a bricklayer, and he taught his son, my grandfather, to be a bricklayer as well. It was, you might say, red brick all the way down. Abner had a double house, artfully shingled in a fish scale pattern and painted white. You entered by the wraparound porch supported by 6 slim columns. There was a creaky swing for 2 on one side of the central door and a ceramic whiskey jug on the other, gray with pebbled salt glaze. If you touched the jug's surface, it felt like the skin of an orange. The 2 front parlors, living room and dining room, were for receiving guests and for show. Between the parlors was a central hallway known as a dog trot, which connected the front rooms to an identical structure of 2 rooms in the back. The kitchen and the master bedroom. Behind the house were outbuildings built of rough-hewn pine logs streaked with black pitch as if by a child's handwriting. A smokehouse, a barn for animals, pigs, cows, and a mule, and farther away, the tobacco barn for curing tobacco. Above the front portion of the house was an attic where my mother and her 2 sisters, Nancy and Velma May, known as Punk, and her 2 brothers, Alec and John Wesley, played when they visited on Sundays. There was a chest up there filled with old dresses and suits. My mother and her sisters would pull out the dresses and try them on. Then they would dance around the attic, taking turns twirling an old umbrella like a parasol. It was the first umbrella my mother had ever seen. When we visited my great-grandfather Abner, when he was slowly dying from diabetes, he never left his bed. Both of his legs had been amputated by then, and the rest of him, truncated, lay hidden under thick, dark blankets. I was only 5 or 6 at the time, but I can still remember the dark word gangrene filling the room like a suffocating smell. For me, the word still has the thick and cloying odor of tobacco leaves drying in the pitch-streaked barn. My mother's father, Alexander Raymond Thomas, gave up the tobacco side of the business to concentrate on brick. He attended a vocational school not far from home and learned to build the great brick ovens in which bricks are fired in Sanford and elsewhere. He traveled as far as Texas to lay these ovens, kilns made of bricks for making more bricks. Late in his life, he teamed up with my dashing Uncle Alec, whom he had taught the bricklayer's trade. Together they established a factory for making handmade decorative brick. One spring, it must have been around 1960, my grandfather packed the trunk of his white Cadillac with beautiful long bricks and drove to our house in Indiana, and right there laid our mantelpiece. Carrying the bricks one by one from the big, thin sedan, I knew in my hands what bricklayers have known for 1,000 years, that bricks are human scale, made by hand to fit in the hand. My grandfather showed me how to get the mortar spread with a pointed trowel like icing on a cake, just right. He was a connoisseur of well-laid brick. He would point out to me with his stub of an index finger the shortcomings of certain walls and buildings. Graceless attempts to hide a careless alignment of brick or a shoddy mortar job were never lost on him. He believed in his fingertips that honesty in brick was as important as honesty in any other transaction. My grandfather referred to his missing index finger as his trigger finger, and I always thought he had lost it in the war. I wasn't sure which war, maybe the Civil War. Later I learned that he had lost it as a teenager while feeding corn cobs into a shredding machine. My grandfather was a mason of both kinds, a bricklayer and a mason. He wore his Masonic pen to the Methodist Church on Sundays. Arriving at my grandfather Raymond's house on U.S. Highway 1 in Cameron, North Carolina was like some fantasy from Oz. Sneaking up from the highway was a long driveway laid entirely in red brick, herringboned, like a winding signpost, signaling my grandfather's profession. As a teenager, my mother had helped to lay that driveway, couching the red brick in a smooth bed of white sand. The driveway led up to the white frame house that Raymond had built with his own hands during the Depression, when no one could afford his services as a brick mason. When our sky blue Opel station wagon shifted gears for the slow crawl up the red brick drive, my two older brothers and I knew our destination, the swing in the bamboo grove. A huge oak, big and strong as my grandfather himself, stood in the white sand by his house. Dangling from an upper branch was a thick rope holding a plank swing. At one end of the swing's flight was my grandfather's chimney, laid in the same red brick as the driveway and tapering artfully with the stepped diagonal pattern you see in certain paintings of Vermeer and De Hoop. On the other end of the swing's swooping curve was my grandfather's bamboo grove, an exotic flourish of Asia amid the orderly tobacco rows of North Carolina. My grandfather was a passionate fisherman, and he had planted the bamboo to supply the fishing poles he couldn't afford during the Depression. He had dammed the creek down by the old Route 1 roadbed, a ghost road of riven macadam overgrown with weeds, and he stocked the resulting pond with bass and bluegill. When he took me fishing, a highlight of any visit, he would deftly bait the hook with a fat pink night crawler, which wriggled on the hook like his missing finger. My mother swam in the fishing hole with her sisters and brothers, watching out for water moccasins among the cattails along the stream. The old road was full of nooks and hideaways, inviting the resourcefulness of children. The three girls played with paper dolls cut from Sears Roebuck catalogs. They made furniture and cars from shoeboxes and pieces of paper. On the old road, there was a huge outcropping of quartz with moss and little plants growing in the cracks. There they built elaborate paper doll houses from leaves and flowers. Swinging on the swing in the bamboo grove, your reward for a good push off the chimney with your feet was to fly up into a spangled world of bamboo foliage and sunlight, green and gold. Then you had better twist your body immediately to get another push, or you might bruise your back against the hard brick. Between brick and bamboo, that was the journey and that was the return. You learned from the soles of your bare feet that these were two different materials, two different principles of strength, the solid red brick and the yielding green bamboo. The swing was the source of complicated pleasures, especially if John Wesley's 4 daughters were visiting at the same time that we were. They lived in Richmond also, though their Richmond was in Virginia, and ours was in Indiana. On Sundays, they wore white dresses with petticoats. Teresa, Debbie, Betty, and Sharon. The petticoats were fun to watch as they floated up like unfurling blossoms into the bamboo leaves.